I had no idea what an architect was or anything about building until I was at an undergraduate at Yale and took a course given by Vince Scully on modern architecture, which was a fantastic course. I mean, almost everybody at Yale wanted to take that course at one time or another. And the people in the architecture school took it every term. So I think I took the course 5 times.
Really?
We used to sit and he would make jokes and fall off the stage and we would throw tomatoes at him and it was it was really an incredible experience. But he generated a tremendous amount of interest in architecture that no one had done before. And I think that a lot of architects started with the same way I did. And more importantly, a lot of important clients started from that course too, because you had all these hotshot Yale kids winding up in the business world
Hmm.
with the background in architecture that their cohort didn't have because they didn't take the Vince Scully course. So I mean, he was a hero of mine, Vince Scully, until he took the turn and went to the dark side. And when postmodern came along, he bought the Kool-Aid, which was unfortunate.
Yeah, postmodern was a very dividing, it still is a very dividing issue.
Yes, but it's time has told. It's not a question of a debate or a dialogue anymore. It's just the reality is there is no. It's gone, which is good. It's like what it'll feel like when the pandemic is over.
Wait, so let me ask you then. So, well, so sticking with the narrative. So, when you entered Yale, you didn't enter as like a for a Bachelor of Architecture, right? You were an
No,
undeclared,
I was an undergraduate.
right?
Yeah, so I got a degree in a Bachelor of Arts from Yale, and then I ultimately got a Bachelor of Architecture. That was after 7 years
Oh, wow.
of both undergraduate and graduate.
I see.
And later, they sent many years later, I think 15 or 20 years later, they sent me a letter saying that my Bachelor of Architecture was equivalent to a master's and that I should write in and they would send me a master's degree, which I didn't think wasn't worth the stamp really. So I think technically I still have a Bachelor of Architecture instead of a master's.
Wait, so how does that work? This was obviously after you became really well established, I assume, and they said, considering all the work that you're
No, I think
doing.
no. I think it was no. It was across the board.
Oh, wow.
They just realized that the training we had, it was ridiculous to make that equivalent to a standard, regular Bachelor of Architecture. It should have been a master's. So
Interesting, interesting. And you didn't take it. Not worth it.
no, it wasn't worth it.
Yeah.
What does
Um,
it? What does it? What does it mean at the end of the day? What does it mean? Zero.
yeah, it doesn't mean much once you start practicing. It means
Yeah.
zero. No one really, no clients care for sure.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, but the Vincent Scully course was that? I mean, that was it was an architecture course, but a lot of different professions and majors took that course.
Yes, because we had there's a certain number of courses we could take anywhere in the university we wanted to.
Hmm.
So you could take a course in rocks and stars, or whatever it is that it really interested you that didn't fit into your major. And ultimately, it became a major. Architecture became a major for me, and so that my senior year at Yale was actually my first year in architecture school.
Wait, so let me ask you: do you remember what it was about architecture that convinced you to, major in it and then obviously pursue a career?
I think it was kind of seemed like a heroic pursuit,
Mm,
and it seemed that it was very tangible.
mm,
And I always loved to make things, and so most of the early courses had to do with making. There were a lot of the Bauhaus courses were still extant at Yale.
hmm.
Albers was still there, and I took his color course. So it was amazing. So it was the kind of the continuation, part of the continuation of the Bauhaus that came to America from when Hitler, destroyed the whole place.
At that time, I'm not sure of the dates. Was this just after Louis Kahn had been a presence at Yale? Was his influence still present?
It was his influence was definitely present, but he had moved to Penn at that time.
Okay.
And his students would sit at his feet, and he would say things like, what is a school? And he'd go, a school is a bench under a tree, and everybody go, ooh.
Yeah.
That never impressed me. I don't think he was a really good teacher, but on the other hand, his buildings were incredibly good, and each one of them was like a course in architecture. Whereas Rudolph, who was the dean at Yale for the whole time I was there, was an unbelievable teacher, but his buildings were not so good. That's my take on it.
Wait, what makes you think that his buildings were not so good?
Well, for one thing, they fell down and leaked, and that was what happened to him. He never really developed the professionalism and the office that it was required to make his buildings work. So very quickly he got much more work than he could handle, and all of his projects were in deep trouble. And that was why he because he was in the prime, and he was probably the most published architect in the world at that point.
Wow.
The Art and Architecture building was published everywhere. But the buildings he built after that, most of them just failed, technically. Then he wasn't really able to survive that. His career didn't survive the bad technical aspects of his building.
Yeah, he's an interesting person because certainly within the profession of architecture and the studies of architecture, almost everyone in the United States for sure knows of him. I don't know about abroad, but he's pretty niche. Like he seemed to have a very high intensity short period, and then that's what he's known for, and that was kind of it.
That's the reason.
Interesting.
And his early houses in Sarasota, Florida, were brilliant. They were just fantastic. But they were very simple. He just couldn't handle the complexity, and he could get away with designing his houses with these beautiful drawings he made, with a very thin rapidograph. He would sit there and make these beautiful drawings, but that wasn't enough to build a complicated, multi-story, multifaceted building.
Yeah, and we'll get into it a bit more. But I would imagine if a person was struggling then, it would be nearly impossible now with how much more complicated things are.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but I am curious, what was Paul Rudolph like? Because on all the photographs, I think he had like a buzz cut. He looked like a very severe person.
He wasn't severe. I would say he was intense. He was the consummate architect. I mean, it was his life, and he was an amazing teacher. He just, and if for example, any of the students had anything in their projects that remotely looked like one of his buildings, he would just go crazy.
He was upset by it?
He was upset by it. You could not do anything that looked like his work, because you were meant to study the problem and come up with your solution. You were not meant to copy what he did. So it was, I would say it's probably also different from Kahn. I'm sure Kahn liked his students doing Kahn buildings. Rudolph hated students doing Rudolph buildings. And in today's world, where you have studios, where it's even worse, because it's expected if you take somebody's studio that you'll be sort of working in that style or in that mode.
Yeah.
Which I think is terrible, just terrible.
It's an interesting question. So I teach undergraduate architecture, and there are definitely teachers, as you said, and more of them, I feel like, where an entire studio for an entire semester or an entire year of work is meant to be, as you said, in the style or in the mindset of, a particular architect or the teacher. And I've always found that to be a bit odd. I mean, I do see kind of a value in role playing for short projects. Like I was just telling you before we started recording that one of my very first projects was to design a museum. And this was very early on in my bachelor career, in the manner of you. And at that time, I was so young that it was just more of an exercise, and it was sort of helpful to kind of hit the ground running, so to speak, because otherwise I would have been frozen. But I can see where, like, later years, like fourth and fifth year, you should probably be thinking a little bit beyond just copying somebody.
Yeah, I mean, what generates the design, what generates the narrative of a building? If what generates it is it's just like somebody else or something else, which is what I find to be the essence of postmodernism. When your building is like something else, or like somewhere else, or like something else, it's not able to really be what it wants to be, using Kahn's language.
Mm-hmm.
What does the building want to be? Not what would Paul Rudolph do if he had this project?
Right.
So it's hard enough to figure out what you want it to be, rather than trying to interpret what somebody else wants it to be, which gets further and further from any kind of authenticity.
Right. Yep. I think that's a very good word, authenticity. Let me jump to a specific question then, because I think it's relative to this part of the conversation. You guys had done a pavilion, which was directly adjacent to and sort of part of a Mies van der Rohe project. Was that really challenging? Because in a sense, you had to, honor what you would do, but also relate to what's there because it's Mies van der Rohe.
It was hugely challenging. Actually, we worked on, there were actually two projects. So the first one was this completely separate pavilion. And then the next project, a new owner wanted the original house to be added to, which is an absolute no-no in the world of Mies van der Rohe. Just touching this iconic piece was really bad. At one point I gave a talk and a lecture about the building at IIT. And halfway through the lecture, the old faculty stood up and left the room in protest. It was quite something, because I had touched the Mies building with an addition. So the first project was a separate pavilion. They could tolerate that, but they couldn't tolerate the fact that you would actually alter the genius of the building. It was some genius, actually. None of it worked. And it was really interesting stories about how no one knew how to build buildings like that. It was all experimental. And oddly enough, Mies was a design build, because nobody in Connecticut could build that type of building. So one of his younger office employees came and lived in Connecticut and built it. But one of the things that was funny was that when the sun would come out, the building would expand and it would start singing. And then when the sun would go down, it would start moaning. And this was all outlined in letters to the client. It was quite something, reading the history of the building. But we forget how all of the things that those architects were doing was really fresh and new.
Yeah. And
they had the courage to be doing these new and different things that had not been tested. And then Rudolph did the same thing, but his buildings were much more complex. So they when they didn't work, they really didn't work. One of his projects, as I remember it, had to be bulldozed the second year after it was built because it just fell apart.
Oh, that's horrible. That gives me heartaches right now thinking about that as an architect.
Yeah,
that's frightening.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of that probably has something to do with my desire to make sure that didn't happen with my buildings.
Right.
And the only way I could imagine making sure that it didn't happen was to make sure that you built them.
Mm-hmm.
So the Mies house is a good example because our design was very complicated. It had to be, it looked very simple, but the simpler a building is, the more complex it is to actually make. So the contractor just couldn't do it, had no idea, had never done anything like it, and just was completely at a loss. So I and my office had to do the building while the contractor essentially watched it. But I had to do it because I was protecting myself. Had he done a really bad job, it would have accrued to my reputation, not to his.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So one of the reasons for the design build is defensive, and they say the objection to design build is that you assume more risk.
Yeah.
I look at it differently. If you are designing a building and you're concerned that it's done right, the risk is giving it to somebody else to accomplish it. That's really risky. Taking over the responsibility to build it yourself is difficult, but it's not risky because you have the ability to make it right.
Yes, and I want to hear all about why you went down that path and how you guys operate, because design build has become a much more common term these days, but I think the way you guys do it is pretty hardcore, I guess would be one word to describe it. But going back to Yale, so you finished your time at Yale, and then we had read that I think shortly after you ended up in Japan for a short period of time.
Yeah, we did a series of houses right after. In fact, even when I was in school, there was a culture of just going out and building. So we had a group of 4 or 5 people that would frame a house in 3 or 4 weekends. And so we were doing that. And when we got done with the framing, we would get to the next trade. We'd come back with questions to our teachers. And we'd say, well, what do we do here? And what kind of a detail should this be? And of course, they had no idea, which was telling to me. I wonder, why are these teachers? So we would go to the next trade, and we went to the local lumber yard, and we'd get a book on electricity or plumbing or whatever it was, and we would do it.
Wow.
And we found out that it wasn't so complicated. It was pretty simple. And in fact, the people that did it were not geniuses. Like the local plumber or the local roofer was not a genius. He was a roofer or a plumber. Mm-hmm. And we were supposed to be able to absorb all of that information and all that knowledge, which is quite a task because there's so many trades. There's so many, as the buildings became more complicated. Mm-hmm. The responsibility or the need to know all of these trades gets more and more necessary. So what's happening in the world today is that as things get very complicated, it becomes even harder for architects to assume that they have the knowledge or they have the ability to actually build things. But the reality is they certainly have as much knowledge as the people who do build things. I probably shouldn't say something like this, but you might say, if you're worried about roofing, it all and that kind of detailing, it all seems very complicated and knowledge based. Mm-hmm. But then I ask the question, have you ever met a roofer? and had a conversation with them. They understand what they've done. Yeah. In the past, they don't understand that they understand that they did something in this kind of a condition. We did this, but they don't understand why they did it. Mm-hmm. We have the ability to know why, and our that's, so that we mix our that's and our whys. Whereas the construction world tends to deal in that's. That's what we did. That's what we've always done that. We've done it that way for 30 years. How can you tell us that's not the way to do it? Mm-hmm. And then you say to them, well, Have you ever gone back and looked at your building 6 months after it's done? No, we never go back. What do we want to go back for? So they don't even learn from their own, they tend not to learn from their own trade. They just move on to the next. And then they say, well, that's what we did in one place, but maybe it didn't work.
Or maybe it worked, but there's a better way.
Yeah, all of that. So I just became less and less convinced with the way things are done.
Well, I think that's interesting, that last point, because if architects are working on more custom-built projects, whether it be large-scale or small-scale, like single-family stuff, there's always this issue that we hear very often, and you've heard it, between the architect and the contractor. The architect says, let's do this, this is the building, and the contractor says, nope, we're going to do it this way because I've done it before, exactly as you said. Or it's a new condition. No, I don't want to solve that new condition. We're just going to do it this way and change your design to kind of fit what we've done. And I've always had an issue with that, one, because I don't think that's the right team mindset to have. But also, as you said, just because you do something over and over doesn't mean it's good or great. And we hear people touting all the time, I have 40 years of experience. Well, if you have 40 years of doing the same exact thing, that's not really 40 years of experience. That's like 1 year of experience that you're just duplicating.
Yeah, and with the 40-year-old technology.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
The other thing that happens like that is when we apply for RFPs for other projects like a university library or something. It's clear that whoever selects the architect is looking for someone who's done 6 libraries.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the list is made up out of people that have done a lot of libraries, all really bad libraries.
Right.
Instead of seeking someone who has done something, very well, mm-hmm. and assume that if they've done one thing very well, they can do something else very well. So there are a lot of, it's a frustrating world, the world of project selection and architect selection. That's a whole nother issue.
Yeah. Well, so you are design build office, but leading up to that, you had mentioned that maybe, sort of the lessons that you learned from Paul Rudolph's mistakes influenced you. But did you ever work for a construction company as part of your experience prior to starting Peter Gluck, or now Gluck Plus?
I never really worked for anybody. Huh. I did go to Japan. We were talking about my trip to Japan. My wife's a Japan scholar, so she had a big fat scholarship to go to Japan for a year. And I said, well, that's great. I'll come for 6 months and then I'll come back. But I got so involved in Japanese culture and Japanese construction that I stayed for 2 years.
Wow.
That's how I got to Japan. And I learned a lot from Japan. Not only aesthetics, but it's hard to live in Japan for any period of time without being completely influenced by that, the attitude, which are many differences, really conceptually different from Western architecture. So when I got back, I did an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art on modern Japanese aesthetics. It was called Shinjuku, the Phenomenal City. It was about Japanese planning as opposed to Western planning and Japanese aesthetics. It was really fun. So and Japan has never left me. I don't think you can spend much time there without it influencing you.
Well, we vacationed there one time for 2 weeks, and we talk about Japan every week
month?
we talk about Japan. But what were some of the influences that were really evident to you in terms of the architecture or planning or styles?
The whole idea of sequential space became really something that I found very comfortable. And looking at a building or designing a building, not with the idea of what it was as an object, but what it is and what it is in terms of how you experience it and how many different ways you can experience the same building and how you can be directed to experience it in a specific way and then many different ways. So, and I think that fell in line with the desire to have buildings be all encompassing rather than be objects that you look at from outside.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's the experience of buildings. It's the experience and the light and the changing aspects of the world we live in that adds to our sensitivity. And people just don't think of it that way. They think of it as a fixed object.
Right.
It's not a fixed object. It changes depending on where you are and how you, not only how you experience it, but where you are in it and how you got there. It's a much more complex set of ideas.
Is it hard to think about a piece of architecture that way, when you're working on it? How to say this? Like, one might assume, based on what you said, that therefore in the architecture designing process, that you would rely more on three-dimensional imagery, or like now videos produced with computers, as opposed to fixed, static, let's say, plans and elevations. Or, do you know what I mean, kind of? Or like, what is the... To me, I don't think that the computer-generated imagery helps, because it tends to be very static, because there's so much time spent developing the model that by the time the model is done, in our design process, by the time that model is done, we would have gone through 3 or 4 different iterations, rather than just waiting for this kind of super accurate, but not so accurate really, image has been produced. So the computer is a whole another one of my bête noire. At every aspect of what we do, it has tremendous advantages, but it also has tremendous disadvantages. And we tend to focus on the advantages. And of course, we're sold on the advantages, literally, by the makers of the software. And there is really very little, what would you say, understanding of what the advantages are as opposed to the disadvantages. That's an interesting point. I mean, yeah, for sure. In terms of specific licensing for software, there's like updates and new releases every year, which cost thousands of dollars, and that's a sales pitch. But what are some of the disadvantages you see with using the software? I mean, the advantages are, I would assume, like efficiency in production work, right? Production, drawing CDs and stuff like that. But
the advantages are that if you want to change something, it's possible. It's quicker to change. Mm-hmm. We used to. I still remember, working on vellum with erasers, and the electric eraser. I don't think anybody even knows what an electric eraser is, but that's how you had to delete. You would delete by putting your tongue on the electric eraser and going.
It was this rotating thing, right? It spun around.
Yeah. It was like a little drill.
Yeah.
So by the end of a complicated project, the vellum would be just about a millionth of an inch thick, because so much would have been ground off. The other thing about drawings, the disadvantages, when you look at the drawings that we used to make by hand, and you can pin it up on the wall and look at it from 5, 6, 10 feet away, and you can read it. You can't read a computer drawing, whether it's up close or whether it's far away. It's like a whole bunch of chicken marks, because it's so hard to control the line weight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think there's been a huge disadvantage in devolution of the quality of construction drawings directly related to the use of the computer. Really? The drawings really suck, and contractors hate it. The other thing that's possible is that you can print the drawings directly from the machine without ever actually looking at them. Yeah. So in the machine, you can look at them in different ways. But once it's printed, you can only look at it one way. But no one has ever looked at it that way. The contractor or the tradesman is the first guy that ever really sees the drawing. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's been no adjustment or alteration or understanding of what the drawings really are. No one, the architects never see them. They see them at whatever scale they want to drill down into, and bits and pieces here and there, but they never see their drawings. I'd be surprised. I'd be interested to know how many architects and how many drawings are actually sent directly from the machine without ever having been viewed by the architect, sent directly to the contractor.
It's an interesting point. So you're saying, you said that a lot of the drawings suck these days, and it's primarily because of legibility, right?
Yeah. Well, just that, that funny little thing called legibility, which is, can you read them, or can you understand?
Right.
That.
Yeah, it's a good point, because a lot of offices, they junior staff and whoever who's producing the work have relatively small monitors. They're low resolution, and you're looking at something that's meant to be printed not at the size that you're looking at, and it's really disorienting. Actually, it's now that I think about it, it's very disorienting to work in that flow on the computer. And in a lot of places I've seen, they will print it out in-house to have a full-size set, to redline it and stuff like that. But that happens probably not enough to get to the level of legibility that you're describing.
I mean, there's no question that the drawings are not nearly as good. They're pushing towards doing things like, once you have a window selected, if you change the window manufacturer, you can pop that drawing in, and you don't have to go through the whole set of drawings and change windows all over the place. Mm-hmm. And you can calculate how many windows you have and what they cost and all of these kinds of things, but none of that has anything to do with really understanding what you're doing. It's just when you think of it, it's pretty unimportant relative to the overall quest, which is to create a manual to build this very complicated thing. You're building a manual, and I think it's very similar to the tech world. You seem to probably, given your age and so forth, you're probably pretty technically savvy. How many times have you gotten a new program and gone to the manual to figure it out?
I don't think ever.
Never.
I don't bother. Can't be bothered. Too complicated to read those things.
Right. Okay. So now translate that to what we do, which is make buildings. Same thing. We're making something complicated like a computer program, but we're making the manual to make the damn thing.
Yeah.
And that manual. So we're not making a building. We're making a manual to make a building. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's in comparison to the way the relationship between the maker and the user, or the maker and the manufacturer. Mm-hmm. It's a good example of where we fail, because we have to make the manual. People, all they have is the manual. You can't go from a drawing to the building like you can from the software to its use. You can go directly, but you have to figure it out yourself.
Yeah, it's an interesting transition from in the process, the typical process, which is the architect, does the design, does this construction documentation, then you just like drop it off more or less to a contractor who a lot of times is brand new. They've never seen the project before. They've never met the client prior. So everything's brand new, and they have to look at this giant set and then build a building from it. And really, I sympathize with a lot of the contractors, because
first thing they have to do is they have to figure out what it costs to make it.
Well, yeah,
that's their task, to take this thing in this mess of drawings and try and figure out what does it cost to make this. Just think of what kind of a daunting task is that.
Yeah, I don't envy it. Yeah.
But there are ways to do that in such a way that it becomes a learning process and becomes a process of partnering with the makers, which is what we do. While we're designing the building, we're working with the subcontractors, and we're taking their input and feeding that back into our drawings. So there's a dialogue between us and the various trades, and they love it because they're given, they're respected. Mm-hmm. Because if a plumber does that every day, so he's going to know more about plumbing than we do. But having the arrogance to say, no, we know better than you, do it this way, and then they have a hard time with this. One of the reasons they have a hard time with architects. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But in our methodology, we consider all of the subcontractors partners, not adversaries. The system is built as a typical legal adversarial system, which we have tried to undo. And we feel that a lot of the problems across the board come from that adversarial legalistic way of siloing everybody's set of responsibilities and risks. We're willing to share all those risks and responsibilities with everybody working on the project. So it's very complicated, but it's a very simple idea when you think of it in those terms.
You mentioned you never really worked for anybody. So when you started your office, did you know from the very beginning that it was going to be a design and build operation combined together?
Well, that's what we were doing.
Yeah.
So it didn't seem to. I guess as soon as we worked with a contractor, we realized how inefficient and how ridiculous it was, when we could do it much better than they could do it. The example being the Mies project, where we had to do the contractor's work, and at the end of the day, he got his pay, and we didn't get anything. We got nothing. What we got is that the building's going to work, mm-hmm. and that this sliding glass, these walls of sliding glass, which emulate Japanese shoji screens, are going to actually work, as opposed to not working.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting also because I feel like, for sure, this is a fact, I think, like the trend for the profession of architecture over the course of the last, probably a couple hundred years, is that we started off, like in the early days, the architect, in quotes, was designer and builder kind of all wrapped in one. And then somehow over the period of time, basically, I feel like the architect's role has decreased. And generally speaking, I think your practice is an outlier. So generally speaking, the role of the architect is still on the decline, I feel. Like architects becoming less involved with, first the architects being divorced from construction, and then architects being less and less involved in construction today. So we've seen the last X number of years, more architects are just doing drawings and not even performing CA, or clients don't think it's necessary.
Yeah, initially, the AIA suggested that, or didn't suggest that in their contracts, they said that, no, okay, architects, to avoid liability and responsibility, yeah, you can't supervise a building, because if you supervise a building and you attest to the fact that there's XYZ in place, when XYZ is not quite in place, you're liable and you're going to get sued. And since lawyers' job is to sue people, they're really good at that. So they said it seemed very logical. So don't do supervision, then you can't get sued. That makes sense. But what are the unintended consequences of that move? Architects are removed from the construction site, so they have no idea how anything is built. They have no idea what it takes to put your hand up into a place and turn the nut, and it gets much more complicated than that.
So actually, it was the AIA who was kind of responsible for that change in contract, which led to
yes. If you look at they're beginning to change it a little bit. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the contract that they provide, it says that architects should visit the site occasionally to understand whether things are sort of done like they think it ought to maybe be done.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, the language is very hesitant. Yeah.
And you should go to the job, every so often, every couple of weeks or every couple of months or every couple of years or.
Yeah.
So what happens when you have generations of architects who have never been on a construction site, don't have any idea of how things go together? And that's finally caught up with us. So the shit has finally hit the fan. And so the next step, of course, is, as contractors become more sophisticated and are able to use the software better than architects can, because they can pay more money. They can pay more. If you go to work for a contractor, you're going to make probably 25 or 30% more than as an architect. Well, why is that? That's because construction is a legitimate business. Everybody understands that, but architecture is kind of a hobby. What do you get actually? So you get some undefined quality or something, but what you also get is complete ignorance of the process of making what you've designed.
Yeah.
So you've nailed it exactly. Your description is perfect, and the drawings that architects are resigning themselves to is making cartoons, and then somebody else is going to make a building out of that. That making a cartoon or a flashy drawing from a computer is not. That doesn't make good architecture. It just doesn't. And it's a way of retreating from responsibility so that you slowly erode the profession and there's nothing left. So I'm really concerned that architects will be making cartoons and they won't be real, what we would call architects. They'll be kind of stylists.
Yeah, that is a really, really good point, and it touches on a lot of different things within the profession. I think you're right, though, and I think that's also why I think the gap between architecture education and architecture as a practice or construction is also widening, because architectural academics have become even more academic and more detached from any of the stuff that you're talking about. And I do agree that for a lot of them, frankly, I think it's the mindset is of retreat. It's safer.
So it's also safe. Self-defense.
Yeah. Yep.
If you're a teacher, you an architectural teacher. I probably shouldn't be saying this. Architectural teachers are going to be hating me, but that's all right.
They can take it.
They are teaching because their teacher thought they were really going to be a great teacher, and their teacher it's the same thing going back several generations. So what you do is you have teachers teaching students how to become teachers.
Yeah. But
teachers of what? So it gets, as you say, esoteric is a word that gets more and more esoteric.
Right.
As the profession and the making of buildings gets more and more complex, extraordinarily complex. And it's a retreat, total retreat from the real issues of making environments and making buildings. It's a terrible story. I was in somebody's office, I won't say whose, in Texas. I won't say where.
I was going to say what city in Texas.
And I'm not going to say.
Okay.
And so I saw their office, and they were about the same size as mine, maybe 30 or 40, maybe 45 people. And I looked at the work they were doing. The work was just incredible. They were doing campuses and parts of cities, and I said, my God, how do you do all this work? And they said, well, they have a really great kind of renderer who makes these images, and then the office sort of takes these images and somehow structures all the various consultants to deal with all the various aspects of what's on the drawing. And then he said to me, we have this one renderer who is so good, understands our style so well, that they're beginning to design our buildings. So we'll have the renderer will make the drawings, and then we'll go from that renderer. We'll try to work backwards.
Yeah.
And do construction drawings or at least idea drawings from that initial kind of taste of what the environment they're making. Maybe that's a way to do things, but it's just not my way.
Yeah, it scares me. And actually, that reminds me, we had spoken with an architectural renderer. That's what that's what he does. On this show, he was a guest, and he was saying, and I was not aware of this, that fairly often they will get architecture offices, not students, but like proper offices, coming to them with basically building massing for like a campus plan or something, and they say, okay, make it look realistic.
That's it.
It's shocking.
And then the next thing, either the contractor or maybe the architect will take that rendering and develop the details that are kind of glued on those boxes.
It is scary to think that all these different facets of building, and they are separate facets, but they all have to come together at some point, but that all of them are so isolated in that kind of process. It seems like that's maybe a recipe for disaster.
It is a disaster. It's a disaster for, young architects are so great. They care, they're really smart, they work their tails off, and they're just a tremendous lost resource. And I think it's the way, because of the way they're taught. And the way it's pernicious. What's happening, and I'm really fearful for the future of architects, and that one of the reasons I am on this hobby horse and go around the country trying to explain this to people, it's because I'm really fearful of what the profession is going to be in the next generation. Well, your generation, actually.
Yeah. So do you think that maybe one of the things that should happen is to have more courses and learning about construction during the education process?
It's really hard to do that. It's I think that what has to change is you can't have the academy teaching those kinds of things, because the academy is not the place for it. They've already absented themselves from any of that kind of real world stuff. I think the way the education probably has to change is that students can do the conceptual work that they do in schools, which is really critical. They have to figure out what the buildings are about, and culturally and historically, what is the meaning of what we make as a society. But I think that you have to learn the nuts and bolts, dealing with nuts and bolts. So I think the education has to match construction and the construction environment and the construction thinking with the conceptual thinking. So I think maybe summers should be spent, on a construction site. It doesn't take too long to get it, to begin to understand how it works. One of the things about architects is they're very smart, and they really care, and they're trying to figure it out, and that makes them unique out there on the construction world, because that's not the profile of your normal job super, let's say.
Right.
So I think that has to be attacked from both sides. I don't think we need to get rid of the academy, but I think the academy has to loosen their hold a little bit and realize that there are that it used to be that when you go to an architect's office is where you learn the nuts and bolts. Well, the architect's office no longer knows anything about nuts and bolts. So there's no place for anyone to learn construction and making stuff. There's no place.
Yeah. Well, that's why you start your own office and you figure it out. It's faster that way. So one of the other things that has happened, I think, as a result of this this direction with the profession, is that contractors have therefore assumed more responsibility. You had mentioned like contractors are able to pay more and you leverage software in a certain way. But I also see very often that more and more contractors are saying, well, we also do design work. So we are design build. A lot of contractors market themselves as design build, services.
That's right,
And
and that's where the architects are going to be in your generation. The architects are going to wind up being in the contractors. They're going to be working for contractors.
it's happening. Yeah.
Oh yes, it's definitely happening. Definitely happening. Well, why wouldn't it happen? If you could leave, a typical kind of theoretical architect and starving to death and double your salary by working for a contractor doing real buildings. So I mean, how many people are going to stick it out when they have kids and whatever the way that it's clear, if you go into any architect's office and look for how many 50-year-old people are working there, usually it's 2 or 3, and everybody else is 40s, 30s, late 20s. Where do they all go? What happens to them?
Well, the first thing the first thing is you leave New York City because it's too expensive. And
do you think it's any different if you go to a smaller town? You can live, but you're going to be in that same relationship to people who have a real job, but like working for a contractor. I mean, it's terrible. It makes no sense. Culturally and historically, it makes no sense, but that's the way it is.
And we've actually even heard from, the office, Weissman Freddie, the New York-based office.
Yeah, sure.
They were a guest on our show, and I think it was Marion was saying that, so they do large-scale, cultural and like education buildings. And they were saying that even in terms of contracts, they're saying that where institutions are more and more looking to have the architect-contractor client relationship be that the client hires the contractor, hires the contractor, who in turn hires the architect. So they're still separate entities, but the architect is contracted through the contractor, and she sees that as being very problematic.
It's not design build; it's build design.
Yes, yeah.
So most in the real world, most people when they think of design build, that's what they're thinking of.
Build design.
They're thinking that build design, that all of the money and all of the safety and all of the real stuff is in the anything that takes responsibility is in the realm of the contractor, and that ethereal stuff, whatever it is that makes a building look or smell better than another one, that's the contractor's or the architect's role, and it doesn't go across the whole period or the whole cost evolution of cost and time. It's something that's kind of an additive thing that's kind of glued, like we were just talking about. It's kind of glued on the front.
Mm-hmm.
And the contractors can pay twice what an architect can pay. So the really facile computer jockeys are going to be working for contractors. And the architects are going to have the youngest architect, the youngest people, the youngest computer jockeys. And when all the programs that they learned and are really, really familiar with are superseded by other software, then the young dudes coming out of the colleges who know all the new software are going to, have a 2 or 3 year kind of good period before they're supplanted by the next group of computer jockeys. So that's what school is tending to be. How much time when you're in school is just learning software?
Oh, we were talking about this the other day. Even if the school doesn't offer specific courses about a software, it's a huge portion of time because the computer software these days is fairly complicated. Most of the software that people use.
Fairly complicated. Revit. I mean, we're forced to use Revit. It's not good for us. It's not the best program for the way we build, but clients want Revit. And so can I hire somebody who doesn't know Revit? I can't. What are we going to do? Take somebody else and have 2 people not working while they train this guy in Revit? So the schools are realizing that if you want to place young architects in good firms, you have to teach them Revit. You have to teach them all these programs, and then what are you doing?
Yeah,
it becomes automatically, it spins away from the academic world of architecture to the technical world of architecture, and that's so that all the faculty are struggling with that. They don't want the students to spend time learning programs,
well,
but they're not going to get jobs if they don't.
I know.
So
I know. It spins it to the technical side, but not even the technical construction side. We're talking about abstract computer software space. And wrestling with that stuff.
No, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. And it's tough because there's only so much time in the day, then at the end of the day, I think that's what it comes down to. And when you spend, 5 hours of a 10-hour day or whatever, trying to understand how to work with this machine, there's not much energy and brain power or time left over to actually learn the true academic things, the academic side, the theory, the reason why you're doing this building, the design of the building. All of that gets all the life for that gets sucked away because of this, this tool, this highly complex tool.
Yeah, it's a huge sucking machine. You can hear it just sucking everybody's brain.
Yeah,
it's a terrible device.
The other thing that you brought up, which I thought was interesting, was the idea that architects and what they offer and their value, a lot of times is understood as being this very elusive thing. The more qualitative aspects of a building, like you said, how it smells and how it looks and stuff. And it occurred to me that that's a great way to actually realize and see that our profession is very fragile in comparison to like construction, which is much more realistic. It's quantitative. You can see it. You can feel it. The building has to stand up. And just broad scope, it makes me realize that it'd be quite easy for our profession to kind of just disappear, because it's not like, how do you explain to someone quickly and succinctly the value of what we do in comparison to something like, well, I'm a contractor, I build buildings, pay me this much to do it.
But you're describing the reality already. That's why, and we do it when we have the same people doing both design and construction. And when they're working in the office or they're working on design, they have one pay scale. And when they go and become job supers and they're working as contractors, they have a different pay scale.
Really?
This is to let them know, this is to let them, I mean, that's the way it is. But no, I mean, for most of the time, I'd say for more than half of my profession, when I would go on the job, my own job, I would probably be one of the lowest paid people on the job. The plumbers would be making more money than me. And still pretty close to that.
Well,
most people want to talk about design build as a business model.
Yep.
It is an incredible business model because as I say, that construction is a legitimate business. People realize they have to pay for it because it's important that it not fall down. Whereas design can't not fall down. Design can't fall down. I mean, I would say that 98% of the buildings that we build design-wise have fallen down. Because the design is so bad. But the reality is that when we do a project and we assume both roles, design and construction, the income we make from construction is what allows us to do the design.
Really?
We would never be able to do the work we do if we were simply had to subsist on the architectural fees. There's not enough money for an architect in a standard architectural fee to design the building.
Yeah.
It just isn't. So, I mean, it takes time. It takes a lot of thought and a lot of time. And, we're willing to work long and hard hours. But still, at a certain point, when you're 35 or 40 and you have kids, you've got to be able to pay for people to live and go to school and so on and so forth. But with an architect can't, if he's just making an architect's salary of what the project takes in. So there's all kinds of ways in the office How can you make it more efficient? How can you not do this? How can you not do that?
Yeah.
Instead of how can we assume this? How can we take this responsibility on and make it an additional fee? And how can we really provide what the world is willing to pay for?
Right.
So that's an interesting aspect of the design build phenomenon, that anyone of the smart young architects could, just by deciding to go to work for a contractor, could almost double his salary.
Don't say that. We're going to lose even more people.
Well, it's a force that's no one's going to listen to me. It's a real force.
It is. I mean, we've seen it firsthand. A lot of our friends who, when we lived in New York City, they were architects working at offices, and they hit that age group you mentioned of like 30 or 40, and they start having kids. And I think once you have kids, that's when life becomes really real, and the financial situation becomes very, very evident. And a lot of people jump ship, meaning they leave architecture to go to do real estate or something else. It's great for them. They're making more money, but for the profession, right, that's an issue.
It's an imperative for them. Unless they're willing to become a kind of an architectural monk,
right?
And and to sit naked under a waterfall or something.
Yeah. So I want to talk more about your business. So you guys are licensed contractors, right? So for most of the projects, are you the, I guess we would call it, the general contractor and the architect all wrapped up into one entity?
Yes.
Well, so how did that start for you? I mean, did you just get your contractor's license on your own, or did you partner with a general contractor outside of your office and then merge, or how did that come about?
No, in the beginning, the contractor licenses are pretty simple. I mean, if a small contractor can get a license, I promise you, an architect who's graduated from major colleges can get a license. It's not at the local level. It's not much different than getting a driver's license. And at what it takes to get a license, a construction license in New York City, you have to have, I think it's $20,000 or $30,000 in the bank for 3 months running. That's the requirement. So getting licensed, and then we have to take these tests. So I have licenses in lots of states. So wherever we go, we do a building, we just get the license. It's just like one of the nasty things you have to do. You have to go to some horrible place that teaches you, how to take the exam, and you're next to everybody. Barber's licenses is that they're studying next to you, and sex therapist licenses are right next.
Yeah,
it's a real downer doing it, but we just do it. It's kind of philosophically onerous, but in reality, it's pretty straightforward. We had to go through the same crap to get our architectural license, even worse, much worse.
So can you tell us more about how many people are in your office? How many are trained architects only, or construction trained crew?
Yeah, so everybody's an architect.
Okay.
We don't hire construction people from the construction world. We've tried that a couple of times, and it hasn't worked. It's a totally different mindset. As I say, the unbelievable, unrealized asset is having architects who are smart and willing to work really hard and care. Like, those are 3 characteristics that you don't find many places in the market. Everybody's an architect, so everybody is. We have people from Europe and all the good schools and all the good places, and they're really smart, incredible people, and we're trying to get them to a point where they have more tools in their or more arrows in their quiver than their competition, so that when they get to be 40, they'll be the one that they'll come to somebody like me and say, I'm not making enough money. I can't pay my rent, and my kids need training or so forth. I need X amount of money. Can you pay me or not? And I would say, yes, you're worth it, or no, you're not worth it. It's horrible like that. No, it's not a question of the fact that you're not good and you're not really smart and that you're not a big help, but are you worth that percent of the fee money that we get to produce these buildings?
Yeah.
And the answer most of the time, of course, is no, you're not.
Yeah.
So what we say to architects is, you come here, you're not going to stay here forever, but you have the ability to learn and get the tools that will allow you to be unique and be the 50-year-old that's in the office, as opposed to the 50-year-old who's the facilities manager of, I don't know, an office building or something. So they are all, we have about somewhere between around 40 people. It goes up and down depending on how much work we have. They're all architects. They tend to have about a 5 or a 6 year stay period. And they work really hard, and if the ideal is that they start with a project and work with a team all the way through, from initial conceptual design through actually finishing the building, and commissioning it, making sure that it works for a year or so after it's finished.
Wow.
And then we work all over the country, so people are willing to go and live in places like Birmingham, Alabama, where we're doing a big project now. So the team that's down there has simply moved there. They lived there for 3 or 4 years. So the young architects are capable of doing that when they're in their 20s, early 30s. But by the time they're 50, they can't do that.
Right.
So that's the way it works. But if you are a job super, and most people in the office have at some point been at the very least on a job, but in many cases actually run the jobs. They have a resume or a history that is unique, and anybody would want to hire them.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Very hireable.
Valuable, yeah.
Is ARCS, ARCS construction, is that part of Gluck Plus, or is that? Yeah,
well, that was we rebranded and became Gluck Plus, as opposed to Gluck and Partners, or as Gluck and Associates.
Mm-hmm.
Just Peter Gluck. So ARCS at one point was the construction arm.
I see.
And now we have different companies. We have a company that can actually hire laborers.
Right.
It has a lot to do with insurance. The construction insurance is very expensive. As in New York State, as much as 6 or 7%, sometimes even 8% of the cost of the building goes for insurance. But oddly enough, the insurance for construction is a cost of the job. It's like the plumber. Nobody pays for it. It's just it's below the line, as they say.
Mm.
So it's paid for as if it were materials of construction. It's just another construction cost.
Right.
But somehow the architects have been bright enough to figure out how to pay their own insurance. So I pay a lot of insurance for architectural design, errors and omissions insurance. But architects pay for their own insurance, whereas contractors don't.
Right.
So why is that? How the hell did the architects ever how did they ever hand me this ridiculous profession? What were they thinking about when they, in the last 50 years?
I don't know. I think that question might be directed toward the AIA, because I feel like they should be the institution to.
They're not. Let me tell you that it's the AIA. My opinion, the AIA has been, for the large firms. Their major concern is making sure that there's plenty of fodder coming out of the schools to people their offices with young, relatively low cost labor.
Wait, and what makes you say that, though? I mean, I know the situation, is that, but why
they never mention, or they never fight for the reality. They never allude to the realities that I've been talking about.
Mm.
It's everyone's afraid to say these things. I don't give a damn. I don't mind saying it, because that's the way it is. but very few people. Everybody will nod their head, yes, 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 but no one will say it.
Right.
It's I don't know what it is. It's kind of I don't know. I guess they're justifying their own position. They know what the reality is, and the AIA is an organization. It's like an institution. It wants to maintain itself. It wants to reproduce.
Yeah. It wants to reproduce.
It's a virus.
So technically, more legally, in terms of how your office is structured, you do have to have, for insurance reasons and other things, separate companies.
Yes, we do. Yeah, we have separate companies. Like if you go to McDonald's.
Yeah.
McDonald's is a franchisor, and all the franchisees basically are McDonald's Chicago, McDonald's 32nd Street. They're all separate, separate entities.
Yep.
Right.
So we have separate entities, sometimes for a specific job, sometimes for multiple jobs. When to set up a company is easy to do, and we just it's an arm of the brand, which is Gluck Plus. So we have Gluck Plus Construction, Gluck Plus Construction Birmingham, blah blah blah. They're just separate little companies.
You had mentioned that you had always, your practice started off as design build because that's what you were doing. You were building, and then you started an office.
Yeah, the first buildings I just built with my own hands. Mm-hmm. There were 4 or 5 of us who, would take tools, and on weekends we would go and build. It was a different time. The first house I built was $12,000.
Oh.
For materials, and so it wasn't hard to find people who would like to have a vacation house built in the woods or a beach house built on the beach, and if it got washed away, if you got 5 or 6 years out of it, it was worth the cost.
Right.
And there were it was pretty simple. Things were pretty simple. Now they're incredibly complex with rules and regulations and at every turn, inspections and on and on and on.
Well, I was wondering could you describe, because I know it's become more complex and complicated, but could you describe for listeners who maybe don't know firsthand exactly what that means? Could you help quantify or qualify exactly how much more complicated has it become with the rules and regulations and even the specialization of the construction industries?
I think it's hugely more complicated. But still, at the end of the day, it's the same thing. It's no difference. It's just more of it. It's like when we were making those simple houses, maybe we had to deal with 4 or 5 trades, carpentry, plumbing, electric, finished carpentry, roofing, glass. You didn't even have to deal with glass because you would buy windows. So maybe you had 6 or 7 trades that you had to deal with. Now there's as many as 20 or 30. So there didn't used to be really complicated rules from every town. It's got this zoning rules and the requirements for construction documents are difficult, and all of the sustainable stuff is very difficult, and the measuring buildings for heat loss and heat gain and capturing water and all of the stuff that it makes sense and we need to do makes everything more and more at every turn, makes everything more complicated, and they're often always unintended consequences. So what makes a lot of sense, and you put it in place, when you actually go to follow the guidelines, you realize that there are problems they hadn't thought about. Mm-hmm. For example, we in California we just finished a house, and we had to collect all the water from the site and store it in huge cistern. Really huge underground, which is okay. I understand that, makes sense. But what happens when it rains and the cistern can no longer hold the water? You shoot the water out onto the street. So when the first time that condition happens, which will, in maybe 5 years or 10 years from now, every house is squirting all their water into the street that's going to wash Mulholland Drive away. That's an unintended consequence, as well as that probably adds $70,000 or $80,000 to the cost of construction. So we talk a lot about doing affordable housing, and at the same time that we're making housing more and more expensive, rather than looking at how do we make affordable housing, which gets to another aspect of our office, which we do a lot of work for not-for-profits. We do a lot of affordable housing as well as unaffordable housing. And we're in Harlem, and we're committed to doing all that kind of work. Because as difficult as it is for the private world to get buildings built, it's almost impossible for not-for-profits to get office space into charter schools and all the kinds of buildings that are necessary in the inner city. That the architectural profession is tough enough to do it where there are so-called real fees, but where there really aren't many fees. Yeah. The profession has abandoned that kind of work. Well, we haven't abandoned that kind of work. We do it, and we use our ability to build things inexpensively, and we use our time to help a lot of not-for-profits.
So do you feel that one of the reasons why doing that kind of work is challenging or it's difficult to do that, and there's many reasons, but one of them is that the regulations have become so there are a lot of more and more regulations, and therefore it makes things more complicated and construction more costly. And we've kind of heard this trend echoed by other people as well. So I guess I'm wondering, in terms of the codes and regulations, like, is there a solution to that issue? Because every year, every 3 years or 5 years or whatever, it becomes compounded, I feel like, and it keeps growing. Like, the number of different things and rules keeps growing, and are we just destined to have a fatter and fatter book of things to follow, and until the point where it becomes completely stifling? Or
I think that's happening, and again, it's a question of unintended consequences and siloing of people with good intentions driving around in little white cars, who are make a lot of sense. All of the things that they're talking about are sensible, but there's no relief anywhere. Everybody has got their legs wrapped around their own private concern. Yeah. Whether it's landmarking or heat gain or electrical panels or all of these things, and no one is sort of looking at what the overall consequences of this is. And even the sizes of apartments, in Japan, the average size of a dwelling unit is half of what ours is. But we're unwilling to reduce the size, which would reduce the cost of construction by a significant amount. No one is looking at how do you reduce the cost of construction, except a kind of a one-shot look at prefabrication or modular construction, which at first glance looks to be the savior, but isn't. And we've done a lot of modular work too. We actually did the first modular building in New York City, housing project. Yep. So it's all glossed over. The realities of, like everything else, the realities are glossed over for sales, whether it's of one kind or another.
Well, it's very daunting at this point too, because I think we've ended up in a situation where I'm sure a lot of folks choose to turn a blind eye and ignore it because it feels like perhaps the problem to solve is too massive, or the hole that we've dug ourselves into is too deep. So I'm going to look down. I'm not going to look over that direction because it's too much.
Yeah, well, you also have to eat. The bottom line is
that's true.
So it's one thing to say this is all bad, therefore I'm not going to do anything. But that's not a solution either.
Yeah. So,
to me, the question is, what, as a profession, what kind of tools do we have to attack all these problems?
Yeah.
It's a battle. It's a battle every day. But with the more tools we have, the better off we are. But when we lack complete knowledge or understanding of what anything costs, that's not a good place to start.
Mm-hmm.
Because everything that we're talking about is a question of allocating resources. What is the value proposition of A, B, or C?
Mm-hmm.
And in order to do that, we're talking about what do things cost, what really costs money, what doesn't cost money. So if you just say, well, that's not my job, that's messy, that's for somebody else, you're giving up any sense of responsibility, and therefore any sense of responsibility of control,
mm-hmm.
and any sense of participation
mm-hmm.
in the process.
Yep, that's
so
a really good point.
we'll never get to use our initial training, which in our heads, where we're concerned about the quality of things, the smell of things, the historical interpretations of things.
Let me ask you a question, and this is maybe more for from a client's perspective, let's say, because previously we were talking about design build versus build design. Now, I think for a lot of folks who are not trained in architecture or in this industry at all, they don't really understand the difference. And what's interesting to me is that you make it very clear by what you said today, also on your website, and you guys have a lot of material that's intended to be for clients, like videos and stuff. Make it very clear, though, that we're
architects.
You're architects, and that we are architect-led design build, and you say that in all capital letters. It's very, very clear. Like, what is the difference for non-architects, non-professionals? Like, what's the big difference between architect-led design build versus build design build? If that makes sense.
Okay, so what has our training been? What is our knowledge base? It has to do with providing the needs and wants and artistic endeavors of our clients. That what is the narrative of the building? What are they really trying to achieve? All of these kind of very ethereal and complicated, but very, very real issues. So that if it's architect-led design build, we start there. We start as an architect would with the needs of our client, but with the knowledge that we know the implications, the cost implications, and the construction implications of these needs and desires, and as we're able to determine how to maximize the site, the budget, everything that they bring to bear. That's an architect. That's where it starts. That's where the project starts, and the financial part of the project is necessary, but it doesn't start with that. So
Mm-hmm.
in contractor-led design, build design as opposed to design build. Rather than the architect having that contact with the client, the contractor has that relationship to the client. His knowledge base is based on what he's done. We did that. We did that over there. We did that over here. It's like this. It's like that.
Mm-hmm.
And his knowledge base is based on what normal standard construction costs, not what you can achieve XYZ with for less money by doing XYZ,
Mm-hmm.
but simply the standard cost of things. The standard detailing, everything is standard.
Yep.
So it appears to be much safer because the vulnerability of a client is financial. If the project goes over the budget and he doesn't have the money, like when we do inner city clients, they have so much money that when Yale designs a building, if Bob Stern's building costs twice what it was supposed to cost, the grads just write checks. But in the real world, that doesn't happen. So, That's the difference. That's the difference. So that the contractor-led design build, which works best for bridges and highways and places where the actual functioning of a building is specific to the needs of the client.
Yeah.
You can identify the needs quite simply. You want to crank out as much beer as you can in the smallest amount of space with the least amount of overhead. That's where he would start, as opposed to where the architect would start. What kind of beer do you want? How do you use the brewery to develop a secondary business of selling on site and hooking that up possibly with the restaurant and beyond.
Yeah.
The way a contractor might start the dialogue.
It's an interesting question, because I think honestly it might be the core question that I think all architects have to be able to answer when asked, because all our architects are asked that question, even if it's not explicitly stated, within the current climate that we're in with the profession.
The pejorative way of discussing it would be like if you were hired, if I was an architect and to do a build design project, that the builder or the contractor hires the plumber. He buys the equipment, he buys the toilets and the sinks, and he buys the architect. Mm-hmm. It's the same business diagram as buying a toilet. You buy the architecture.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the same diagram, the same link between the contractor and what he's buying.
Yeah, I got you.
Construction is a process of buying. Mm-hmm. Which is another thing that people don't realize. It's really fun buying. Everybody loves to buy stuff. So basically what we have when we have a new project that we're doing design build, we have a big bucket full of money. And we roll into town and we say, okay, now how we're gonna buy this project. It's really fun. And construction is fun if you think of it that way. How do I maximize? I figured that for windows, I've got a budget of $2 million. So I'm going to buy glass for $2 million. Let's try to buy the best glass we can for $2 million. That's fun. That's what you do every day in your own life. When you go to the shop for vegetables, how do we get a deal on tomatoes? It's the same thing. But the architect he's selling. He's sitting in his little room with the white tabletops, and he's waiting for the phone to ring to try to get some job. That's selling. And he's calling people, do you have a job for me? Do you have a job for me? That sucks. So that's one of the reasons why construction is so much fun, because it's buying. You buy the trades. That's the language of it. You buy the plumbing, you buy the electric, you buy the framing, you buy the glass. It's fun buying. It sucks selling.
So it's pretty clear. So you would say that a lot of the success that you've had in the office, naming specifically, like you said, the amount of time that you spend on your architecture, the fact that you do work for nonprofit organizations, not-for-profit organizations, and et cetera, is because of the fact that you are design build, and the construction fees are what allows you to basically cover this other portion of work, which would not be sustainable otherwise.
Period. Done. Perfect.
So if that's the case, and if we look at the profession, profession-wide, if working at a standard architecture office doesn't pay enough from an employee's perspective to feed kids and to have a life at that age of 30 or 40 and whatnot, and the other alternative is to work at a construction company or somewhere else, is the solution for the industry for more, if not all, the offices to transition to design build?
I think it is. I think that they're probably really specialized offices that might be designing a specific type. Mm-hmm. But I think generally, I mean, at the very least, I would say that it's absolutely imperative for architects to begin to assume liability and responsibility rather than shedding it, rather than spending their entire life avoiding responsibility and avoiding liability and avoiding this dirty thing called money. for some reason in the academy, as soon as you do something that has to do with money, you're dirty. You're not an artiste. You're not an artiste anymore.
Yeah.
You're just a thug.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had young guys on the job go out and they're first dealing with the subcontractors. They come back and say, you know, all he cares about is money. Well, what the hell do you think? It's only you, you moron.
You're totally right, though. And actually, so in my education, I felt that same experience, what you're describing, that money's dirty, you know, we look down upon it. I wasn't taught that directly, but that kind of atmosphere was very present.
It's there. It's there, right. I think that our work and our kind of, I don't know how the profession views us, but I think they view us a little bit suspect, not a little bit, probably quite a bit suspect, because regardless of what the design looks like, it's somehow sullied by the fact that we actually built the work. Instead of saying, my God, it's fantastic. These guys not only designed stuff like this, but they actually built it. And there's some relationship between the two. They could never have done these projects with the budgets they have if they didn't build it. That's not the first thought is, oh, somehow they're involved in something that's nefarious somehow. Mm-hmm. Which is really weird, but it's purely self-defense.
Yeah, you're probably right about that. I mean, I think, so speaking for ourselves or myself, I would say the work you're doing, first of all, the work you guys do, just in pure design, I've always admired and thought it was just very elegant. And it's modern work, but it's sophisticated. It's really, really well done. And then to combine it with the fact that you're doing it with a certain kind of operation, you know, and you're involved in construction, you're doing the construction. I mean, to me, and I feel like for a lot of listeners at around our demographic would agree and say, well, that's fucking how we should do it. Because, I mean, myself and all my friends and colleagues were way too aware of all the problems you brought up. It's like, yeah, that we can't afford anything. And I think for a period of time, myself and other friends, like in New York or elsewhere, were very bitter because we were raised or taught in school a certain kind of thing, a certain philosophy. And you get out practicing, it's like, well, this is not sustainable. Like, I can't feed myself. I can't afford to be here. What the fuck is happening with this profession? And we end up, you know, kind of where we are. So I would hope that when people listen to this, they feel inspired more than anything else, because I think what you're saying is accurate, it's factual. And then what you're doing seems to be a great way to solve your immediate problems as your own business, but also potentially even profession-wide.
Yeah, I think if more people did it, it would change the whole perspective. And rather than trying to get approval as architects from the community at large by having I don't know what, I don't think that the architects do anything to improve their reputation. The reputation to start with is pretty bad. You know, an architect, oh yeah, funny glasses, the roofie leaks, busted budgets. You know, they're just the fall guy for the whole process. Mm-hmm. I could go on for days talking about how the architects are just the fall guys. They just take the hit for everything that goes wrong. Yeah, and they participate in it. They don't do anything to solve it. So it's what is the solution? I think that more just if contractors can do it, why can't architects do it?
So let me ask you then. So let's say a younger office was starting, or they've started, and they have an interest in becoming design build, but they don't have a background in construction. You know, they don't have that knowledge. Is that going to be like really difficult to do? Because, you know, you guys started your practice, I don't know how many decades ago, but because the construction industry is so much more complicated, is that like almost...
The place that I see it working is in sort of suburban areas where there's a lot of work going on, and it starts relatively small. It starts with, you know, fixing up a garage into a dwelling unit, redoing kitchen, dining room, deck kind of thing. And if architects went out and sort of made alliances with builders, so say a young builder and a young architect get together and then they say, we can, from the builder's point of view, it's having the architecture on board means that the owner doesn't have to go try to find an architect and then have the architect fight with the contractor.
Yeah.
So they can give them a fixed price for the whole thing. In other words, what is the value proposition? What can you give the client that's going to mean he's going to bite, he's going to take it. It's a good deal for him.
Yeah.
So I think architects have to make alliances with those in the construction field, and through several jobs, you'll get the knowledge. But if you're not actually doing it, you'll never get the knowledge. So you have to figure out how to do it, how to start. And there's so much work out there, but not coming down through the architecture magazines.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't even any architecture magazines left. So that'll tell you something right there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There are no architecture magazines. So that would be, and I see that happening. I see, and it doesn't take much. In fact, a lot of people from our office, I encourage people to do that, and several have and are doing really well with the exact same model that we have here.
Oh, I see. To start their own business or an own off. Oh, I see.
Yeah, and not be so worried about it. I mean, everybody said to me, "Well, why would a client, have an architect to build something?" So the first client I asked, I was really scared that he was going to say no. I said, why don't you let us build this? Because the contractors are just not good. You know that every time you've dealt with a contractor, you've had trouble.
Yeah,
they all know that.
Yeah,
they just think they're picking the worst of the two,
mm-hmm.
Or the best of the two. And I said, why don't you let us build this? We build it. We have the ability to do it, and it's going to work out a lot better. And he said to me, "You mean you will do it? You really can do it?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Great, do it."
Yep.
So there's this fear that doesn't really hold out if you have the courage to just try it.
I think that's true, and a lot of clients are willing to do that, and frankly, also, a lot of clients, they don't know a lot about this profession, and the architect is a trusted expert, right? And if you advise them, they're going to hopefully believe you. And clients really, really like the idea of simplifying stuff, right? If I can just turn to one person and they take care of the whole thing, that alone is probably one reason why so many of the build design operations are successful. It's a one-stop shop in a way, right? It's so much easier for the client.
Of course.
Is there any disadvantage for a client to go with a design build model versus the traditional architect contractor?
I mean, the original reason why that you wouldn't do that, the fear is that the fear was, it's a ridiculous fear, but the fear was that if you're designing something and you design a heating unit that's worth $10,000 and you're building it so you can stick one in there that's worth $5,000, you can steal $5,000 from the owner.
Right.
Now, if you're dealing with a legitimate person, I mean, no one has ever suspected me of stealing $5,000 by putting in a furnace secondary. I mean, it's absurd.
Yeah.
It's just absurd.
Yeah.
It comes from a totally different perspective. Maybe during the Depression or something, but I mean, it's ridiculous. In fact, I read recently that the AIA made it amoral or not against their ethics for an architect to be involved in any aspect of his work that had to do with money. That was the original prescription against any kind of design build. That came from I think the teens.
Really, I do think that when clients are looking for a design build, they're considering a design build office to hire. If you trust them and they're reputable, or you just trust them, then it should be fine. Where we've seen it's problematic is when a client hires a design build office and they trust their construction expertise, because I think honestly the construction expertise is so foreign to clients. It's like, I just have to trust you that you're good, and I've seen your work, it looks decent. The problem comes in the design portion. When they hire a design build office who's not really good at design, it's not what they do, and they don't like the design that they come up with, then it's like an impossible task to try and resolve, because they don't have the skill set to rectify that. And they end up hiring an outside designer to take over. They have an outside architect plus this other design build company. It gets really messy.
Yeah, it's messy to start with and gets worse.
Yeah.
But the reason, the good part of the design build is that the builder portion is the one that gives legitimacy to the architect, so that the architect doesn't go crazy because he's come from school where he wants the room to look like a rabbit's hole or something, with the CNCs, machines, stuff all over the place, and his budget is $20,000 and it costs $200,000 to do it.
Yeah.
So the contractor standing there with his tool belt gives legitimacy to the group. So you have the guy with the tool belt, the big guy in his flannel shirt, and the architect with his glasses and his T-shirt. They kind of they validate each other, or they invalidate their own craziness.
Right.
They make a good pair.
Yeah. Yeah.
David mentioned earlier, I was saying that you guys do design build and you're pretty hardcore about it. And I think he probably alluded to the fact that your office also prepares construction drawings, but divided for each trade.
Yes.
Which is something I've actually never heard of, but that makes total sense to me in the approach of giving a manual for someone to build something, right? Can you explain where this idea came from, and how do you guys make it happen on projects? Because it seems like more work to do actually than the typical one set for everybody.
Mm-hmm. It is more work, but it maybe it costs 10% more for us, or let's say 10% more to do it. But the potential savings in terms of the cost of construction is maybe 20%.
Yeah.
So because somebody bidding a job, remember you're buying. So you're buying plumbing from one guy. He doesn't know about anything else. He only knows about plumbing.
Right.
So if he has a set of documents that says, this is what you need to do, you don't need to do anything else. You don't have to worry about that on page 312. There's a line that says that the plumbing fixtures need to be all made out of gold. And he's missed that because he's got to go. He's just a plumber, for Christ's sake, and he's got to go through 300 sheets of drawings. And he comes home from work at night and he's tired. And so he says, "Well, they do the drawing. This seems like about a $100,000 job."
He's weighing the set. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you give him like 4 sheets, which is all the work he has to do. Whoa, I can look at this tonight. And I know exactly what it's going to cost. And it's not going to cost $100,000. It's going to cost $75,000. And we know that saves at least 20% of the cost of it. And so when you're talking about a $10 million building, 20% is $2 million.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when there's an understanding between the owner that this is a teamwork, and that the contractor, the design build team, is working for the owner, not trying to get as much money out of the owner as you possibly can. Everything is transparent. Every nickel, and when we work with our clients, every nickel that they spend, they know exactly where it goes. It goes all to their own account. It doesn't get mixed with anybody else's account. The contractor, often you pay him and he's using that money to do something else. So if he gets in trouble, there's no way of recovering that money. Whereas ours is completely transparent. There's no possibility of him being in that position. So it's about transparency. And so when we explain that kind of a thing to an owner, they say, "I understand that. That makes sense. Do that." So that's where the separate trade drawings came from.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. But there's a possible. But everybody will say, well, how about the spaces between? So maybe there's some money in that doesn't get picked up by either one or the other.
Right.
So the lawyer will say, no, you can't do that because we want to go to court and we want to prove to him on page 36 that there was a note that says you got to have gold fixtures. But it'll never get to that point. And that's not the point. The point is to be working together towards that. So there's a contingency. If there's some monies that legitimately are not accounted for, we have a contingent to pay for that, which is the way real construction works. So the problem for us with that in much more complicated buildings is that the computer systems don't make it as easy. It's harder to do for technical reasons. So we've come back off it a little bit, but the theory of what we do is exactly the same. It's not quite as pure as some of our little films show how when in its pure form, how we have like 20 different sets of drawings. So we may have 10 sets. Yeah,
sure. The final question from me is schedule. Does this way of working, does it save time? Does it make the schedule longer for certain phases, for the entire process? How does this impact schedule?
It's extremely beneficial. It doesn't mean, construction is a mess because there are as many as, I think we figured that as many as 80 different entities on one of our jobs. Whether it's consultants or architects or engineers or subcontractors or subcontractors or suppliers. So all of them have to perform, and none of them tend to really perform. So the possibility for time overruns are huge. Yeah, but they can only be overcome much more easily overcome by this kind of a process. For example, if there's a problem in the field, there's a pipe that is in the wrong place, and they want to move it. They can't move it without going to the head of the contracting company, the job super. The job super sends it to his office. His office sends it to the plumbing consultant. The plumbing consultant, when he gets to it, says you can do this, or why don't you do this? Then it goes back to the contractor, then goes to the subcontractor, and then gets back to the guy who's standing there with the drill, ready to change it. That can take 3 weeks.
Yeah.
In our case, that takes 35 minutes because he'll call us. We'll look at the drawings and we'll say, do this, do X, Y, or Z, and go do it. And we avoid all of that craziness, which is the AI book on how to operate. Has all of these forms that you sign, yeah, and to make sure that this $5,000 change is done properly. But the 2 weeks that it takes makes that $5,000 change a $50,000 change, and that builds up over a job. It's a tremendous amount of extra cost, but also extra time. That's what that $5,000 change could turn into a $250,000 extra.
Well, we see the 2 hours went by very quickly. We could keep talking for another 2-3 hours, but this has been really, really great. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I think that people are going to find this very informative, interesting, and all of the above. And I think the work you guys are doing has continued to be good. And thanks for coming on the show.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you guys for listening. If you thought this episode was interesting, then please support our show by leaving a review in the Apple Podcast app. Also, reach out to us. Let us know what you think about this design build operation. Are you a design build office? Do you want to become a design build office? Do you think it's a good thing, a bad thing? I think it's a worthwhile topic for us to talk about.
Yeah, all of our episodes are also available on our website, secondstudiopod.com. We are also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, as well as most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we have the hotline, 213 222-6950. You can send a text message, leave a voicemail if you have any questions, reaction to this recording, guest suggestions, or stories you want to share with us. Feel free to reach out.
Absolutely. And of course, our email is hello@secondstudiopod.com. So that's it. Anything else?
No, thank you all for listening and watching. It means a lot. And share around, make us famous.
No, I really do think that Peter's message, though, is really worthy of being spread. So
yes.
If you guys enjoyed this one, please let us know. And if you know other architects who you think could benefit from listening to, even if it's just this one recording we did, please share it. I think we hope to support what he's trying to say with our platform. And of course, that is also dependent on all of you spreading word when it makes sense.
Yep.
Thanks.
Thanks.
We'll talk again next week or sooner. Bye.
Bye-bye.